Well, good morning, everyone. Sorry for the late reply. I know that I was supposed to post this yesterday, but things have been a little hectic. This is Christian Duran, and I'm presenting this week on Central Americans in Houston, diverse populations. This article describes, according to the author, the preliminary findings of an ongoing study that attempts to identify the different undocumented Central American populations in Houston and to explore their aspects of settlement, work, and motivations for emigrating vis-a-vis Mexican migrants. So it's, in my opinion, an attempt to kind of bring to the conversation of migration the diversity of Central Americans and how they relate to what has predominantly been an understanding of Mexican migration to the United States. And at the time of the study, there was an estimated 100,000 Central Americans settled in Houston, and many of these primarily were of Salvadoran descent. The article was written in 1980, published in 1987, actually, and the study that it writes about took place in 1985. So definitely, this article is a bit dated, but I think it's important to note that it's addressing a very important topic, which is kind of having a less homogenous understanding of the diversity that exists within migrant populations. The article was written by Nestor Rodriguez. Nestor Rodriguez is a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, and he has pretty much focused his work on Central Americans and migration. Um, the methodology that is employed within the article, I think, is important as well. And we see that through the interview schedule that is outlined in the article. There's definitely a sizable amount of space that's dedicated to the methodology of this study, and an acknowledgement that while the size of the sample is not great, and the phenomena, I think, in the mid 1980s is barely being trying. I mean, people are barely trying to understand it. So some of the questions that are brought up are issues of housing, work, community interaction, organizing, and of course, health, employment in origin country, reason for emigrating to the United States, any kind of political conflict that someone may have experienced, the journey conditions coming to the U.S., and the U.S. education of the children here in the United States. And so many of these are important because they really help us to look at the distinguishing factors between the migrants that are being looked at here, primarily Hondurans, Salvadorians, and Guatemalans. And among these distinguishing factors as well are issues of the new cultural elements that these diverse populations bring to the fore, among them cuisine, language, cognitive categories of political understanding. Also, the amount of attention and response that these new migrant populations kind of elicit from law enforcement. Case in point, Salvadorans are perceived with special political concern by U.S. authorities in comparison to like Mexican migrants who tended to migrate here for economic and labor purposes, as well as like community organization experience, particularly like in the case of El Salvador. Again, organizing experience can come to represent an important resource for constructing or participating in organizations here in the United States. And also, another distinguishing factor is the distinct time of arrival. The author notes that many of the Central Americans that are being looked at in the study are migrating in a severe time of downturn in industries that tend to draw Mexican migrants. So the argument that they were coming to the U.S. For jobs primarily kind of goes out the window if we really look at that. Another thing that I wanted to kind of cover briefly is Hispanic settlement and indigenous and Garifuna settlement. The author makes a distinction between the two, kind of noting that the impact of cultural diversity on the immigrants' adaptation is readily evident among the Totonicapán indigenas and the Garifunas from Honduras' northern coastal towns. And ethnic culture has been the source of a strong, cohesive social organization, which provides a level of adaptation support not found among the Hispanic Guatemalans or Hispanic Hondurans. I guess we can take time, if we would like, to really think through this. Why is it that indigenous populations and Garifunas from Honduras tend to have more cohesive bonds within their community than their Hispanic counterparts? And that might have to do a lot with coloniality and the goals of assimilation here in the United States. I suppose that an argument can be made that it's less possible for indigenous and Garifuna populations to kind of blend into American culture, and therefore the cohesiveness within their communities is a lot more marked and a lot more important. The author also notes that these migrations from traditional rural backgrounds fare substantially better than other undocumented migrants from industrial cities, and kind of making note of the fact that some of these indigenas have developed and used community networks to achieve a remarkable adaptation in Houston's modern settings. Again, this is in the mid 1980s, and the author notes that, well, at least to him, this is an ironic situation. That they are faring better than their Hispanic counterparts. I wonder if that could be said now, 20, 30 years after the fact, if that's still the case. But then again, that's something that we can discuss and we can kind of think through and talk about. Garifunas specifically, I really wanted to kind of go over this really quick, who migrated from Honduras' northern coast, are from Afro-Caribbean origin, and are unique among the undocumented Latino population in Houston. And these are the different ways that the author marks that difference. He says that Garifunas settled predominantly in black neighborhoods. Garifunas maintain an active cultural and mutual aid organization. They also maintain close contact with other Garifuna communities in the United States, to the extent that they often have meetings. And these are like national meetings where people actually travel and try to meet together. They send their children, even the U.S. born, back home to be raised by relatives. And they have a social, cultural ability to interact with and sometimes identify with other Afro-Caribbean Caribbean immigrants in the United States. And the vessel for that interaction would be reggae music. So definitely I think that the issue of culture and like social culture and sociocultural kind of elements that help to bond these communities together are definitely important. And also, I suppose that we can talk briefly on page 9 of the article. Rodriguez notes that females or women fuel the development of families, and hence family-related activities such as weddings and baptisms, and these trigger community social participation. And he notes that women play an especially important role in the daily reproduction of community life through their practice of ethnic cuisine. I question, though, and I wonder if other members of the family also play a part in this social and cultural reproduction. I mean, obviously, I understand the idea that women play a very important and commanding role in the reproduction of culture and social aspects that are brought here from Latin America. But I think that that the rest of the family also plays a definite role in that as well. The husbands and children who kind of require the same continuity as when they come to the United States, to want to feel like they're at home, whether that's through cuisine or language, storytelling. So it's definitely, in my opinion, more of a family participation in that reproduction. One other thing that I wanted to kind of briefly touch on is the idea of the social network. The author says that the larger the social network that serves for organizing undocumented migration, the greater the social and economic resources that can be mustered for settlement. Also on page 18, he notes that a social network extending between this country and the place of origin can lead to greater stability for facilitating the immigration of others who can become social resources and who can increase the economic status of the household. Of course, an international social network can facilitate several other things. I think it is important to note that these social networks are not just limited to the people that the migrant might know, but there are networks that are already existent that might not be that interpersonal. They might be more industry related, and by industry I mean the industry of migration. Smuggling networks, word of mouth. There's a lot of economic interchange that happens during these migrations, and they're not always interpersonal. So what I mean is, like, people aren't always counting on friends of friends or family members who have made that trek, but it's kind of this very carefully woven, very I don't know, flexible and fungible kind of network that changes depending on circumstances, and those circumstances being like level of enforcement from the state, both in Latin America and in the United States. That being said, I think that let me see here. I think that we can definitely talk about this idea of social networks and what Ruben Hernandez Leon calls the migration industry. So while social networks on this is up from page 18, furnish migrants with substantial support for settling in the United States, it is work conditions that largely determine their final settlement outcome, assuming that the immigrant or family is not removed by the INS. So given the study's urban setting, workers were not found in the extractive sector of agriculture and mining. A few weeks after being interviewed, and I'm pulling this from the article, a day laborer phoned in to report that he and 12 other undocumented Central American and Mexican workers had been recruited in Houston by an out-of-state agricultural employer. 2 other interviewees reported knowing of similar recruitment cases. So here we kind of see how the industry of migration, at least those actors who benefit from migration, both in labor and even in enforcement, they kind of play a definite role in where people settle, how they settle, and then those individual people creatively find ways to preserve community or create community. The last quote that I pulled was this idea that employers gain advantages from employing a group of undocumented workers. An undocumented work group serves as recruiting means when additional workers are needed, as workers are anxious to find jobs for relatives, friends, or other household members. The social relations in the undocumented work group increase the efficiency of the labor process as workers informally share tasks. This advantage increases with the homogeneity of the group, which reduces competition or conflict between workers. A group with high national homogeneity performs the socialization of new workers. So definitely, different types of industries, whether agricultural or industrial, have found ways to tap into these networks that exist. Now, I don't know whether these networks exist or there's cohesiveness between populations because of the fact that labor demands them to be that way, or if labor is taking advantage of networks that already exist. I lean more towards the latter, that these social networks between migrants exist because of a need to migrate, both politically from Central American countries and sometimes even economically with Mexican migrants. Now, whether the businesses that take advantage of this kind of labor, and understanding that labor is a huge part, right, in the way that people settle once they get to the United States, regardless of their motivations to come here. So definitely that's something that we can kind of look at, is the role of the migration industry. And thinking even about the Central Americans who came here in the 80s, pre-amnesty, Reagan's amnesty that he offered in 1988, whether even that migration was allowed or permitted or not as strictly, squashed or policed, because as some have written before, it's kind of like allowing people from places where there's been political and social conflict to migrate to the United States. It's kind of like a a pressure gauge to relieve some of the pressure in those countries, while the U.S. continues to exploit and take resources from those countries. Some of the questions that I thought about were, I know that this is an old article, and it's kind of dealing with that wave of Central American refugees that was coming in the mid early 1980s. The author makes a distinction between Hispanic and indigenous Guatemalans, between Hispanic and Garifuna Hondurans, but no distinction made between Hispanic Salvadoran migrants and Salvadoran indigenous populations. Now, it might just be me that I don't have that much of a knowledge of the diversity in El Salvador, but it definitely struck me as interesting that Salvadorian migrants were kind of presented as this more homogenous group without making that distinction. So that's one question. Another question is that Rodriguez focuses heavily on the social and cultural networks that help determine places of settlement for undocumented Central American migrants. But maybe we can discuss what the role of employers, smugglers, and recruiters is in shaping the settlement of those migrant populations. And not only the settlement of those migrant populations, but kind of the avenues that are opened up once these smugglers, employers, and recruiters tap into the social networks that these migrants already have, in relation to the family members left back home who might be looking to migrate, and who now are able to have jobs ready for them before they even make that decision. Also, what are some of the considerations we can make in relation to the enclave Rodriguez mentions in his entry? Think about social and cultural reproduction, precarity, and settlement. There's definitely a lot of literature on enclaves and kind of like the cultural, political, and social factors that come into play when migrant populations create these enclaves. They're usually away from other populations, meaning that they don't have the same amount of security. They are very active in the social and cultural reproduction within their communities, so it's something that they bring with them, and they're able to create even being away from home, and also where they settle and how they settle. There's a lot of elements to, in my opinion, to kind of look at when we talk about settlement issues of whether someone's traveling as a single person, as a family, whether someone is considered male or female, and the different experiences that they both have in settlement. And even beyond that, we can discuss the roles of enclaves, the roles of women and indigenous people in the reproduction of culture. So these are some of the questions that I thought about during this article. Again, it is an old article. I think that in no way is this article trying to explain a phenomenon, but more describe it and make some initial claims at least. And we can definitely discuss whether we think these claims are outdated or if they need to be kind of updated with other literature that already exists on similar issues. So thank you for taking the time to look over the presentation. I hope it was somewhat helpful to understand the concepts that we went over with it. And I will see you all next week. Have a good one.